welcome back to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, but not just any fantasy today.
Oh.
Because today, yes, we are talking about a brand new series. First time we're talking about one of this author's books. So a lot of exciting debuts today. We are, of course, from the title, reading Promise of Blood, which is the first book in the Powder Mage Trilogy by Brian McClellan.
That's exactly what we're here to do. This was a book that I pitched to you, Charles. I pitched the entire series in our last Friends Pitching Fantasy. You selected this book of the three great options I gave you. And yeah, I've read this series before. It's a reread, but it was a long time ago now. It was back in the distant year of, I think, 2017 that I read this series, so it feels pretty new to me, even though I definitely forgot a lot of the details. I do remember a lot of the overarching
stuff. There are a lot of details in this book, so I can understand that.
Yeah. I don't know if in 2029 you'll be able to remember all of the intricacies, Charles, but today I expect you to remember all of the intricacies because you just read this for the first time.
I'm ready. I'm ready to have this conversation. You know, I was excited. This one has been in like the fringes of my TBR pretty much since it came out in 2013. You know, we're all it very commonly comes up as like recommendations for Sanderson because McClellan met Sanderson in a creative writing class at Brigham Young University, so there is a little bit of that.
One taught by Sanderson.
yes, met and was taught by, you know. So there's a lot of exciting influence there, and everyone always has positive things to say about this book and the premise. It's like, people snort gunpowder and that gives them magic powers. It's like, okay, sold. Interesting. Yet for some reason, I always just kind of kept it on the fringes. So when you pitched it, I knew I had to say, yes, let's do this. And I am, super excited to talk about it today.
Yeah, it's definitely the kind of book that is... It's almost easier to leave on the fringes because it's like, oh yeah, like this is great for fans of Branden Sanderson. And it's like, well, fans of Branden Sanderson have to stay on top of all of the books that Branden Sanderson is constantly getting out there. So it's almost like being a fan of Branden Sanderson. It's like a full-time job. You got to keep reading all the Sanderson books. And then like poor Brian McClellan can get just pushed to the fringes of those TBRs. But of course, this series has received its own fan base and has quite a bit of popularity on its own, and Brian McClellan has gone on to write a lot more and a lot more in this universe. He's doing all right, and now he's got one more reader under his belt in you, Charles, and I'm so excited. True. We'll have to get into the spoiler section soon, but I guess before we get there, let's hear from you, Charles, on your overall spoiler-free impressions having read this for the first time.
Overall spoiler-free impressions, I'd say it was great. It takes a lot of stuff that I particularly like about fantasy, like the Mistborns of the world, like the Abercrombie chapter presentations, like where it's very ingrained in a character who has a strong voice and like heavy on the hard magic systems and the political factions and the battles. It's all there. So it definitely delivered on its promise of like from the school of Sanderson with a bit more. Its promise of blood and its promise of like a grittier Sanderson experience. You know, it's just kind of like how I would describe it in the very simplest of terms. But Brian McClellan definitely has his own style. He definitely um, has his own voice, and it was really fun to finally get that under the TBR. So yeah, I'm looking forward to getting into it. All the action and the balance of hard and soft magic, which you kind of alluded to in your pitch in Friends Pitching Fantasy. It was, very interesting as well and kind of unique, honestly, for me. So lots to get into there. But yeah, it was very good, and I'd recommend to any fan of Sanderson or Abercrombie or Brent Weeks. He's a natural fit right at home with all those guys.
For sure. I definitely like the clash between, like a direct clash between the folks who use hard magic and the folks who use the soft magic, being
Mhm.
the powder mages and the privileged, respectively. And I think while there are other books you can think of that have both hard and soft magic in them, like there's not as clear tension between the two usually, and they're not usually just like straight up fighting and their respective strengths and weaknesses going up
Right.
against them. So it's cool from the being a fantasy fan from the more meta aspect of that, like hard magic versus soft magic, who will win? Although,
Right.
there's some people at least there's at least some people who don't fall entirely in line with most of the other people of their style of magic, but we'll get into that more in the spoiler section. I'll say it feels very return to form for us as friends talking fantasy to be
Yes.
getting back into this. It's like it's new and it's fresh, especially because of the Flintlock fantasy element of it.
Hmm.
We haven't really read any Flintlock before, but just in the, you said, in the style of Branden Sanderson, but a little bit grittier and maybe shades of Abercrombie in that more, a little more grimdark leaning sense. It's like this is just good old fashioned, like, epic fantasy, not quite questing epic fantasy, not quite like high fantasy, but just like in terms of the just, we've got gods, we've got giant battles, we've got magic, we've got, it's all those kind of things that drew us initially into the genre when we read Game of Thrones, right? Those are the kind of things that really, for me, catalyzed my interest in like adult fantasy, is all the kind of things that are present in this book. So it's exciting to get back into it because we've been reading stuff of all different
Hmm.
like subgenres in fantasy, and it's awesome that there's such a wide array. But this is kind of our bread and butter here,
Oh
Charles. Our
yeah,
bread
for
and
sure. And
butter
it was
is,
it was funny. You had
yeah.
mentioned on right before we recorded, you're like, we need more books like this. And I was kind of like, yeah, we do. And maybe we just need to read more books like this because it's fun to go back to what you describe as this bread and butter for us of these wonderful, grim, dark Renaissance fantasy books. And this one is considerably later, 2013. So that's why we can get a little bit of that meta old school new school clash, and it was just fun. It felt right in the vein of like our sweet spot of what we uniquely enjoy in fantasy. So I agree.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about all the things that we uniquely enjoyed about this book in greater detail, which means that I'm going to have to give my spoiler warning here. And basically, that means if you haven't yet read the first book of the Powder Mage Trilogy, that's Promise of Blood, what we're here to discuss today, and you don't want anything spoiled for you, now is a good time to turn this down in your headphones and go read the book. Come back here. And don't you worry if you've only read Promise of Blood, because Charles hasn't even read the second or third book yet, and we will
I sure
not be
haven't.
spoiling anything from the second or third book. I don't remember enough to even spoil too much, except a few very broad points that I won't bring up. So you are safe here, people who've just read Promise of Blood, and we're excited to go into this deep dive for real now.
For real, indeed. And here we are in our book discussion of The Promise of Blood. Um, there's really like four main POVs. I think there's only four POVs. I'm trying to remember if there's another one.
Yeah, and Maine might be generous for one of
Maine might be generous
them.
for our poor lady Nyla, but there are four, and it it always is kind of interesting to me because the two things I knew about this book were like, oh, this guy came up from the school of Sanderson, it's very like kind of gritty with your snorting of gunpowder and this and that, and that wasn't as in the forefront as I thought. The magic system is actually much more like complex and varied than that, because you have all these different kinds of like levels of magic and different kinds of creatures and different political factions. I think the thing that surprised me the most was like how detailed and in depth this whole world was, and there's kind of like two or three or four magic systems going on at the same time,
Yeah.
and it kind of builds on itself.
Yeah, it definitely does. I think that it's yeah, it's not surprising that McClellan has had a lot that he's been able to flesh out in this world, even more than just the Powder Mage trilogy. There's yeah, a whole nother trilogy, Gods of Blood and Powder. This is a fully fleshed out world in the vein of a Sanderson, in the vein of George R. R. Martin. And I guess
Mhm.
it can be pitched, or perhaps was pitched by me, more along the lines of like this action packed thing with the guns and the snorting and all that. But
Mhm.
I will say yeah, it's this one sets the stage to some extent early on. I guess there's more political intrigue and more mystery, and especially in terms of like Adamat kind of represents the mystery side of all of this, as he's the inspector, the like private investigator who is trying to figure everything out. And I think that we get a lot more politicking than perhaps this is thought as by a lot of people. But the first book, while I still think it does have a lot of action, some of it is definitely setting the stage. And there's a reason that I pitched the entire series to you, Charles, because
Mhm.
for folks who have read this whole book, I would say it's not cliffhanger ending, but I would say there's so much that is like just built toward and hasn't paid off
Right.
yet by the end
Right.
of
It
this
seems
book.
like this whole it's only just beginning kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like there's way more to uncover. One of the last things in the epilogue was like, I'm gonna confront Kresimir and I will teach him justice, something like that. And you're like, okay, well, that's gonna be a whole adventure, it sounds like. So for sure, you can tell that there's a lot more to go on, even beyond just like the different levels of the magic system. It's the different levels of how they all relate to each other, because there's some kind of bit of lost knowledge that I always kind of enjoy in fantasy of, oh man, what happened to Kresimir? What's Kresimir's promise? And we've kind of lost our way a little bit in remembering our history and our ways of life. And like, even though the monarchy was kind of nearing the end of its life anyway, in terms of being like a servant to the public. It's like by just recklessly putting them all to the guillotine, you've now just started a whole bunch of stuff that you have no idea what you got into in terms
Right.
of like gods and religion. It's always fun when it's like, well, it's like, I want to represent the people. The monarch is crushing the little guy. So out with the monarch. It's like, okay, but now, there's all of these privileged and gods and things out of the woodwork that are coming out that you've started. And what I like about Field Marshal Tennis is he knows what he doesn't know, kind of, and that's what I like about him as a character. He knows that, like, okay, there's might be something serious about this Kresemir's promise thing. Like, magic is real, and it is weird that everyone said that before they died. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna send an investigator on the case, you know. So there is a little bit of that happening, and there is the setup and payoffs going on throughout this. So I don't know. It just worked for me. And you did allude to it a little bit in your pitch, Dylan. You were fair in saying that there was some old school, new school. You were alluding to the bigger world out there. But it was nice to experience. And I think there's going to be a lot to get into. I mean, you know, because you finished this trilogy once before, but I can tell there's a lot more to happen in book two for sure. The Crimson
For sure.
Campaign.
Hmm. Well, you mentioned, Charles, the idea of all the sorcerers. Basically, there's this royal cabal of
Mhm.
sorcerers that work for the king. And they, anytime that a group of sorcerers all cryptically whisper the same thing as they die, you do probably want to pay attention to that. And like you said, Tamas, he's a very practical guy, very pragmatic, and at times brutal, but it seems like he is probably well meaning and why he's doing the things that he's doing. And then other
Mhm.
aspects, he just like is like so. I would say he's Machiavellian in his approach to things. Like we've got this quote on one end, like where Adamat, which like epic beginning, by the way, like Adamat's just like walking through in the like dead of night and super
Mhm.
quiet in the like is it like a palace or what have you, and he's like, oh, the Skyline Palace, yeah, and he's like, oh, something is not right here. And then it's just like Tama's basically like sitting on a throne of skulls, figuratively. And he's like, but Tama says, when asked why he did, he's like, I did this for me, and I did this for Adro, so that Manhooch, that's the king, wouldn't sign us all into slavery to the Kez with the Accords. I did it because those grumbling students of philosophy at the university only play at rebellion. The age of kings is dead, Adamat, and I have killed it. Which, by the way, awesome line.
Great
And
line.
so we've got this, like, Temis is a really interesting character in terms of his motivation, I would say, where
Mhm.
he has this background with the Kez having killed his wife, and he also like has served as a pretty loyal, soldier and eventually field marshal to the
Mhm.
king, and he has seen the ways in which like this has become bloated, like the monarchy has become
Right,
bloated and it's
right.
not good for the people. So it's like he's
Complacent
always
and
kind of, yeah, he's always kind of balancing, and I'm not sure if he knows exactly to what extent each of those are motivators for him. Like, how much is he actually like,
yeah.
I'm doing this for the greater good, and how much of it is just like, I freaking hate the Kaz, and like I will kill everyone and leave their blood in my wake if it means that the Kaz don't get to own Adro and I can fight them. I find
Right.
that interesting. And of course, this is a guy who, toward the, I mentioned, I think he's Machiavellian, like toward the end of his goals, if he sees that his son's best friend is going to be a problem down the line, like potentially going to try to kill him, then he has no problem ordering his own son to go kill the best friend that he grew up with. Like, that's the way that he sees the world. And it's kind of, he's a complex character. Like, he's arguably, I would say, is our main protagonist, and we love the buzzwords, morally gray.
Hmm.
It's like he kind of epitomizes that like morally gray protagonist that followed in the like grimdark revolution's wake.
Right. Right. And it's interesting with um Field Marshal Tannis here because he's what Brian McClellan does really well with Tamis is he's kind of walking the edge of hypocrisy, and he never, in my opinion, crosses it. Like there's a lot of nobility about what he does and what he's about. He's got good cause. His wife died, right? So that's a great motivator. And he's always been proactive and respected, even by his enemies. In the beginning of the book, I showed respect for him. And even these like top tier privileged show respect for him. So he, in that case, commands a lot of respect too. So he seems like a natural leader. And then, of course, the monarchy he's overthrowing is inadequate and kind of complacent, and, like you said, kind of stagnant and atrophied a little bit. So they were ousted out. But it's kind of couched in this in these more detailed character moments with Temis, where he sends people to their deaths or he makes those brutal decisions, and even his quasi estranged, like distant relationship with his son Taniel. So when those things come together, it's a really interesting blend, because he can't quite connect with Taniel. He keeps sending him off on suicide missions or telling him to kill his best friend, and even though Taniel is, by all accounts, like a soldier worthy of praise and respect, it's Temis can't, like, is just holding back a little bit with his son and his personal connections. So to have that unique blend is what makes Lord Marshal Tanis my one of my favorite characters, probably my favorite character of the POV characters for sure.
Yeah, I would say he's my favorite character in the sense of being the most interesting character
Mm-hmm.
in terms of like the most likable. And I would say that McClellan, he's willing to give each of his characters flaws and make them all unlikable in certain ways and likable in others. Tama's probably the least likable of the four point of view characters in terms of just what he would be like as a person and what you think of him. But yeah, I would say he's the most complex, the most interesting, the most proactive, and really the driver of the plot, which is why I would say he is the main protagonist of our four.
Right. For sure. And there's just so much more complexity going on with him. He takes so much of this first story as well, that he just kind of runs the show a little bit. But I was impressed with the opening with Adamat, like you said, like
Yeah,
great opening, like the characters very interesting, not quite a Glockta type, but an interesting blend, and like the kind of gritty underworld that he finds himself in kind of is a nice departure from the rest of the stories. And I don't know, like those kind of clever characters who can always puzzle things out and figure people out. They're always fun to read too. It's like, oh man, I miss these kind of characters. I haven't had one of these in a long time. It's just nice. It definitely feels like part of the genre.
yeah. I mean, I would say that it's like there's sort of Tyrion, and obviously
Yeah.
he's
Oh
a
yeah.
different, like he's a noble and all that kind of stuff in Game of Thrones. But there's like Tyrion and Glockta, and there are these like really smart, clever, inquisitive people, and then
Hmm.
Adamat falls in that in that sort of realm of the character. He's not as, I guess, witty in how he expresses his
Right.
like
And there's no
clever
like
skills. He's not as
unpleasant side to his either physical appearance or character. He is like a
right.
family man, and he is like a pretty decent dude. He never does anything like morally questionable in the book,
He pretty
unless it's
much
to
does
someone
not.
who's bad.
Yeah, I mean, you start messing with his family. He certainly has a
Mhm.
temper, and he'd be willing to kill people who
I
got
was
in the way
impressed
and
by
like
that
were
moment where it's like the finger in the box is like, oh, okay, they're playing for
yeah,
real. I didn't think we would go there with like mutilating, the implication of mutilating
mutilating children.
children, but we went there, and I was like,
And
okay.
he was like, "Oh, next, like next, if you kill me, Next, you're going to get a new guy come in with a bigger box, and there's going to be your daughter's head in there. It's like, oh, jeez, like
I
this is
know.
messed up. Like Brian McClellan is willing to go there, and I think like those are the moments that feel grittier than something Sanderson might do. Although I'm sure we could find examples of Sanderson doing stuff pretty much that like that dark, but it's I don't know, child
The
mutilation. I don't know if I've
children,
found that in
rare. I
any
mean, he's had
Sanderson
implied
books.
violence with like blood
Yeah.
all over the room and like um sexual assault and all of that, but I don't know. And even
There's
this
something
wasn't that
about like
particularly
finding your own.
violent, but
Yeah.
the man's daughter, who is a character we've never really like, we met briefly, I think, in the beginning when he's
Yeah.
packing the family up and like telling them to leave town. But beyond that, it's like not really a character we know, but still just the implied, just like the little bit of violence placed like really effectively. Definitely had a strong reaction compared to if it was just, blood everywhere kind of thing. So I appreciated that from McClellan. I was like, sometimes authors threaten to do stuff and then never follow through on the stakes. And you think Adamant is clever enough that he could keep his family unharmed, but not the case. Not the case.
Yeah, and it raises the stakes, of course. Uh, I've always liked when you're in the point of view of a character who is stuck between two forces that are way more powerful than him. And he's like, I basically have to betray one or both of these forces. And it's going to be really bad either
Yeah,
way.
and it doesn't even
And
matter
it's
like
usually like
which
a
one he likes or doesn't like or stands for or doesn't stand for. It's like these two guys are just at odds and you're caught in the middle, dude. So
right. And they always seem like a lot of these good fantasy novels will do that with the character that's like considered probably the most like clever character in the
mhm,
book. And I would say it's handled well here. He's definitely between a rock and a hard place, but Adamat, yeah, a smart guy and a guy who does by the end, I would say he's siding with his principles and trying to do the right thing. So I would say he's kind of the most likable of the three characters and the easiest to rally behind what he's dealing with.
for sure. And I'm going to jump around a bit because I think we're just talking about characters. So I'm just going to talk
Yeah.
about a bunch of random ones. But I said Field Marshal Tanis is my favorite, but there's another character that continually stole the show for me, and that's
Hmm.
Mahali.
I, yes.
I'm a
Yes.
big fan. And I really appreciated Brian McClellan's like attention to detail on cooking and food, which is so underserved in fantasy a lot of times. It's just like Lord of the Rings, like, oh, we'll eat lambus bread and we don't have to worry about food ever again. And like in this book, it's like, no, food fuels the army, and he's actually winning over people by just being a good cook and like all the different
Chef
dishes.
Charles, how dare you?
Hmm?
You said cook.
Oh,
He's a
no,
chef.
I'm saying
That's
he
like his
cooks the
whole thing.
food, but I'm not calling him
Yes,
a
but
cook.
there's like the
He's a
multiple.
chef.
You called him a cook, Charles, and that
That maybe I did.
if he made
I
one
didn't
thing
mean it.
clear in this book, it's that he's a chef and not a cook. And I'm offended for Mihaly, who unfortunately can't be here because he's fictional. And
Hey, he's
yeah, I will
omnipresent,
say
man. He's a god.
that's true. He is Adam reborn, but he Brian McClellan is really into cooking. That's a thing, and
I could tell.
he posts about that a lot on social media. So I think that it's his love for cooking is shining through in Mihaly, and
As someone else who really likes to cook, I and watches a lot of cooking stuff on YouTube, I can appreciate the attention to the detail on that and the focus on food as kind of the device in which he kind of has this Jesus-like character. It's almost like he turns he makes more fish and then turns the water to wine. He's like doing all this Jesus-y stuff, and but he's got this jovial, he's got women around him all the time. He's like laughs and makes jokes, and he's just a funny little character who ended up taking a much bigger role at the end. So we'll see how that goes. And that's part of this bigger story of these gods and how they play a part in the politics here. But yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we gave Mahali a shout out. And then the other character we didn't really
Charles,
talk too
can
much
I
about. Oh
speak
yeah, yeah,
to
yeah.
before you get off the topic? You did mention that you too have a passion for cooking.
Mm-hmm.
We can't get out of this without discussing the fact that both Ashton Kutcher and Mila Kunis have eaten meals provided by you. Is that not true?
That is true. Yes, when I was but a lowly fry cook, and I was actually a cook, not a chef. And I'll never
Hmm.
be a chef. Not good enough for that. But I was a cook at a place that made hot dogs in New Orleans, and yeah, they showed up one day, Aston Kutcher, Mila Kunis, and I was working the grill at the time, so I cooked their food for them, and it was my crowning achievement in cooking, and
Right.
that was kind of the peak for me. But yeah,
You felt like a god. Even if
it,
you weren't quite a god like Mihaly,
I
you felt
mean,
like one
I
for a
pretty
day.
much. I felt very powerful in that moment. I was like, wow, look at me feeding the stars. They have to eat too, and they want to eat good food. So it is what it is.
They come to
I'm
Charles
just
for
glad that
that.
I didn't know. I knew they were there, but I didn't know that they had already ordered. I'm just glad that at the time I was cooking their
You didn't
food,
know
I
like
didn't know I
those
was
were
cooking
there.
their. I didn't know it was their ticket. Like
Yeah.
there's just a line of orders, and you're cooking them through,
You didn't see
and I'm
like
like, oh, let me
Ashton
know.
as the
I
ticket. They
No,
didn't put
I
their
knew
name
they had
down.
ordered. I knew they were there, and I was like, "Oh, let me know like when their order comes through." And then they're like,
You
"Dude,
were gonna
they're
give it some
eating right
special
now." And
attention.
I was like, "Oh, interesting. Okay. Well, hopefully that was good." I don't know. It's
It's
borderline a
probably for the
fast food
best.
joint. You can't really mess it up too much, but you could serve them a raw hot dog or sausage or whatever. It's certainly possible, but
And you didn't do that.
I guess not. They didn't send it back, so it's just the influence that someone who cooks, that a chef can have over the highest levels of society, and Brian McClellan saw that kind of potential and put it in his character Mihaly, this god character,
Hmm.
Adam Reborn, So I got a big kick out of
No
that because
wonder
I
you
too have
related
have
so
touched
well to him.
greatness
Yeah.
and touched godlyhood, so
In the
uh,
kitchen.
in the kitchen, and they were beautiful in real life, for just so people know, it's like they are
Ashton
like,
and Mila.
yeah, they were
Like,
both very good looking, like they looked like movie stars, IRL. So
so you
it's
saw there was like a glow about them, and you're like, whoa, like
yeah,
I
yeah,
guess
for sure.
they're next to such beautiful people all the time in Hollywood that it's like it must be shocking to just see them amongst us normies.
I know, amongst the normies in New
I was just
Orleans, it's
standing
like
right next to them, and Charles was like, "Wow, they really are beautiful."
it's like
In
I really
comparison,
am realizing now how good looking they are,
yeah, I was not there for the record, but
and no, but you
Charles
have
did
eaten
hold up a
there.
picture of me on his phone for comparison when he was trying to determine how beautiful they were compared to
Yeah, it's like, yeah, I remember
a
what you
common
look like.
man.
I was like, whoa,
Yeah.
very
Uh,
good looking. But of course, they're on TV all the time and movies and stuff. So they got that Hollywood magic about them. But it's just funny. Some people have that star
speaking of
power.
magic, Charles, let's
Mm,
get you like that? Like
I
that
do
saying?
like that. I
Let's get
do.
into one of the powder mages, Taniel, who we haven't talked really about at
Daniel
all,
Two
except
Shot.
alluding
Boom,
to him.
boom.
Daniel Two Shot, and I that's something that I do really like about the way that Brian McClellan writes his magic systems is he'll just give certain characters like quirks of what they can do that most other people can't do, even though they're all great powder mages. And it's like Taniel's thing is basically he can like shoot off and bend 2 bullets at the same time, and that's pretty cool. And you get an awesome nickname when you're able to do something like that. Vlora, on the other hand, who is mostly present as someone that other people think about, I feel like. But yeah, Taniel's former fiance, Vlora, can apparently explode gunpowder from really far away. So that's like her special power. But I do like that rather than just like, everyone can
It's
do
kind of
sort
interesting that they all
basic
have like
stuff.
X-Men-esque flares to their ability, so it's hard magic, but also you get that diversity of interesting stuff happening depending on who's in the room, because
Right.
like they all have different strengths, and it kind of goes back to, was it the Knacked that have different skills, like the guy that just doesn't sleep, so he's the
Yeah.
bodyguard.
Well,
Like it adds to some fascinating little spice.
much like Mihaly working in that kitchen.
Oh yes.
And I think that it's interesting, and it remains hard magic because, well, we know that Taniel can do this with 2 shots, and we know that Vlora can do this from farther away than other people, and it's, for any folks who've been talking about hard versus soft magic systems without ever explaining it to this point in the episode, but pretty simply, hard magic, you know the rules, and magic is a tool in the toolkit of the characters wielding it, and soft magic is more mysterious, and it's, like the privileged. You don't like, you have a vague idea, like, oh, they can like shoot fireballs and stuff, but then randomly one will just like turn into a lion or whatever. What were they calling them, like cave lions or whatever?
Right.
Either way, the one. She just start turning into a lion, and you're like, all right, I guess that happens now. And
Yeah, Julene, right? But then she
yeah,
ended up being like a super privileged, right?
yeah, like a
Again.
prede, or yeah, I believe is the word, something like that. I can find it, but they're just privileged that apparently magic has kind of been draining from the world. That's like very
Yeah, a
typical fantasy
predei,
trope, right?
Predei.
Yeah. So they're just privileged, but they're so old and from so long ago that they are from back when privileged were way more powerful than they are now. So they call them predei or what have you.
Right, right.
And
Ancient caste
even
of
the
privileged,
gods, they
immune to old
basically
age and disease.
toward the end, we basically find out that even the gods, like even Kresimir, was just a preposterously strong privileged, or at least that's that's what's implied toward the end. It's interesting. It's interesting to think of it. Okay, yeah, it's cave line. Sorry, I'm just finally found that. Anyway, Taniel. Shall we talk Taniel here, because
Yeah.
he's the one who fits a little bit more into the tropes of what we're used to from a fantasy protagonist, I would say, in
Yeah,
like old
for
school
sure.
fantasy, right? He's like the relatively young prodigy man who can use magic in a way that very few can, but he's got daddy issues, and I mean, you need a few daddy issues to fuel a story, don't you, James?
And he's got lady problems.
Oh yeah, lady problems is a big one as well.
He's got
So,
daddy issues. He's
it
got lady
seems like,
problems.
yeah, lady problems seem to be a common theme in McClellan's book. Not the strongest female representation in this book, I'll say. I think it's. I imagine that this is something that in his later writing he's probably worked in more. But we get, like we said, one point of view from a woman, but she's hardly got any chapters in this one, and like her story basically starts out with her getting like saved by a man when other men were trying to rape her. Like Olam saves her, and then
Her whole
it's a
thing is
lot of like
saving a child, the mother
right,
aspect of that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and then it's like all the other. It's like then there's the like women in refrigerators trope, basically, woman's like entire purpose being motivation for a male character, and that's like pretty common in this too. It's like we've got Timus's wife getting killed,
Mhm.
before the book even started. It's just like now I have motivation. So there's like elements of that for sure in here, I think, and there's like a general lack of agency that it feels like the women have at times.
Right.
I would say like even Flora. It's like we keep hearing about Flora and she's capable of all these things, and she has this dark past with what she did to Daniel, but it's kind of just like she doesn't really have much of a presence when she is on screen. We definitely don't get her point of
Mhm.
view, and we also have her like even the way that she cheated on Daniel to be able to that screwed up their engagement and all that stuff. It's like even the way Daniel thinks about it is like, oh well, there was a Fatrostin. That's so hard to say. Fatrostin noble who was like was a spy of the Kez, and they made him go there and seduce her. So it's not even her fault, really. It's like that kind of strips her of her agency as well. Like,
Right.
she
Right.
could just
It's
like
an
women have
interesting
the
implication
power.
of it. She couldn't
Yeah,
even
like
like
women have
cheat
the
on her
power to just be
fiance on
like,
her own.
right. Yeah, exactly. Like she can't even be have the agency to be responsible for her own
It has to be a
infidelity. So
plot by the Kez.
by a man, by a
Yeah.
man. Like so, there's a little of that. I mean, it's not egregious in the ways that we've seen from other books or books in the past, but it's like a pattern I kind of noticed. I think it could kind of this could have used a more fleshed out female point of view, and having someone like Vlora who does have powder mage abilities and could be a complex, interesting character with their own point of view that gets fleshed out and plays a pivotal role in all of this. Like all of that could have been possible here. So I think that's one aspect of a like what I think is a fantastic book and a great series. It's one aspect that I think could probably have used a little bit more fleshing out, more improvement. But either way, yeah, we do. I do like Kapol. I think
Yeah.
she's interesting, although
Until
she
she
can't
starts
talk.
getting like
But
flirty with Daniel, but I mean even that's interesting, but
yeah, there's a little like, did we need that aspect of it? Like their relationship was kind of more interesting when it was like Daniel doesn't
platonic.
even think about that because she is a kid, and then it's like like toward the end of the book, it's just like actually she's 19, and then he's like, "Ooh, didn't know that," and it's like, all right, that's kind of creepy. Like that all it takes for someone that you viewed as like a child, all of a sudden it's like, oh, actually she is an adult. Then it's like, I'm down. Like that's a little like that happened pretty quick there, Daniel. Although I will say,
That
for
it
Daniel's
did.
sake, like he is like, oh, like this is. I don't like that this is the way my thoughts are going. So I'll give him a little credit. He can't
to
control
to
what he's
his credit,
feeling.
yes, he is trying to fight it, and it's becoming more difficult, especially as Carpole is more obvious, not obvious, but she's definitely starting to flirt a little bit more, imply her feelings more, and this and that. So, um, no, I do like the relationship, and it adds to this like this level of because she's like, oh, she's a savage, that this idea that there's
What would
all
Daddy
of this.
think? That's basically like all Daniel's thoughts are just like, "Ooh, this will really upset my daddy."
Yeah,
That's all he
that and
cares.
also I don't know. It goes back to a part of this book that is about just these social disparities and caste systems and this and that, even when it comes to like the privileged versus the powder mages, like they're at odds and they're at different caste systems in society, and powder mages are considered like unrefined and just kind of brutish, and privileged are considered kind of snobby and upper crust. So then you've got savages and act and all that, and then you have oh god, what are they called? The like Frankenstein monster looking things.
Wardens, I believe.
Wardens, yeah. You
Yeah.
got the wardens who are even lower than that. So it's
Although the privileged, like at least Nicholas, or I think that was his name, right? He is like, oh yeah, I still view wardens as above powder mages. Like,
yeah.
they're like deformed monsters, and he's like, oh yeah, well,
Literally
like,
abominations to
yeah.
to society, to life. Yeah, no, but it kind of plays a part in that, where it's like, oh, love is finding a way, kind of like it reminds me of those stories where like a soldier finds like a indigenous person and they fall in love. It kind of gives me those kind of vibes where you're like, oh, okay, it's supposed to be hopeful, but it's also still kind of like uncomfortable at the same time. I don't know, so we'll see
It's
how that
also got the
relationship
element of
goes.
like he like saved her,
Yes.
and now she's like feels like she owes him at least like protection in the sense of protecting him with her sorcery, which is one of the cool aspects of watching that unfold.
Right, like
Where we
there's
don't
more
like it's
than she lets
Kapol's a
on in terms of her
character.
power.
Yeah, Kapol's the character. It's great we don't have a point of view of, even though, I'm saying,
Yes.
oh, I want more female point of views. It's like Kapol's interesting because of the mystery of like what she's thinking, what she's always doing, like what exactly her powers are capable of.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of intrigue around her in that way. And I liked it when she's just like, in his eyes, she's like this kid who he's going around protect, like it's almost like the Mandalorian and Baby Yoda, like like that's like, I'm just protecting this little fella. It's like,
Who's
but and I
protecting
don't know,
who?
I
You know
think,
what I'm saying?
yeah, then it is like who's protecting who, because in her mind, and probably more accurately, it is like she's way more powerful, and she's the one that Julene, who's a pretty, is like, whoa, 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 all right, we don't have to get her involved, like I can just
Right.
leave.
Because
Like,
from Daniel's point of view, it's nice to see that he's like
or
charging.
that was, sorry, that was Rosalia, not Julene, who did that, if I remember correctly. But anyway, sorry, go on.
Right. But I was just mentioning, it's like when you're in Daniel's POV and you're committed to his point of view, and he doesn't see Carpol as someone who is like powerful. He's just charging into battles, and it's a miracle he doesn't get killed. It's like who's setting these
Yeah.
wards? Like you step through like like a ton of wards that would have probably killed you. It's like, I'm Daniel Two Shot. What are you gonna say?
He's always saying
When
that.
he's got
I'm
this.
Daniel Two Shot.
He's trying to make it a thing. But that'd be more funny if it wasn't a thing and he was trying to make
Yeah.
people call him that. But yeah, and I think that happened like when they're in the mountain, and Borobudur is like, someone's looking out for you, dude. Like there's these wards that have been like built or like disengaged or something like that, and you find out that like Carpol is able to do more than we kind of gave her credit for, when you write her off as like, oh, this is the savage that I saved and she's loyal to me and doesn't talk, it's the perfect female companion.
Oh, shots fired.
I couldn't help it. I couldn't help it. I don't think that's the perfect female companion.
Yes,
That is a
for
stereotype.
clarity's sake, Charles
That's a
is
stereotype.
satirizing over there.
Yes,
He's
yes,
making one of those humor jokes.
yes, yes,
Like
exactly. Thank you.
he would
So,
like strong female characters with volition and ability to speak.
with
And when he
lots of
says,
interesting things to
yes,
say. Yes,
yes,
yes.
when he says that the perfect female companion is not that, he jokes.
Yes, 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 yes. And there's the old sexist trope, of
Yeah,
women talking, and it's annoying to men. So
it's
you
like
make your
the
sidekick a character that
Little
literally can
Mermaid
talk. It's
situation.
funny. It's funny. Doesn't make it right. Makes it fun. So we were talking about Daniel Two Shot. Yes, and then that what we didn't talk about so much. We touched on the kind of strained relationship with his father. At first, I thought it was going to annoy me that their names were so similar, but I actually had no problem switching after the first time. I was like, oh man, there's going to be a Tanis and a Daniel, and I'm supposed to like know who's who. But
There's a lot
Brian
of T's
McClellan,
floating around, even in
yeah,
Adamat. A lot of
yeah.
T's.
I was like, we couldn't have diversified the names a little bit more so that I could follow it better. But I never got the characters confused. There's in such different story arcs and their voices and their
Yeah.
specialties are so unique that it was never a problem. I was just kind of getting nervous at the beginning. But anyway, that goes to say their strained relationship and even the part where you kind of wonder sometimes why Tamis is hard on Daniel and he's like, prove your loyalty, go and kill your best friend. It was an interesting setup because his best friend is magically compelled to kill Tamis. That is a thing.
Yeah.
And they do have like he's a commanding officer. Tamis is a commanding officer, and Daniel's a soldier who has to dutifully follow orders. That's how the army works. But then also just the son father thing, and you want that to you want the love to come through, and they just quite don't know how to make it work. I thought that was a really interesting um some of the more interesting character work that we got in the story. I don't know what your take on it was.
Yeah, definitely. And you learn about Daniel and how he thinks about things, where when they're having that conversation about how he's supposed to kill privileged Borbador, he's like, well, I wouldn't do this as like your son, but I'll do it if you command me to do it
Mhm.
as like I wouldn't do it as your son Daniel, but I'll do it if you command me to do it as one of your powder mages. And yeah, Tamis is just like, yeah, okay, well then I command you to do it as one of my powder mages.
It's like
Like
sweet.
it's zero. And that is kind of a distinction between those two characters in some
Yeah.
ways, where like Daniel sees things as a little bit more, I guess, nebulous and like morally gray and like, oh, like I don't know, like what is right? It's like I think Temas is like pretty much just like thinks what he thinks, and that's the right thing, and then we have to do it by any means necessary. And he's not really going to get caught up on, am I asking him this as my son, or am I asking him this as my like, it doesn't matter. He's just like,
He's
just
like
go kill him. I don't
he's
care in
got to
what
go.
manner I have to
Like
ask
I
you to
would
do that.
prefer it wasn't
Like
your best friend, but it is. So we
right.
got to kill him. Like let's go. That's
Yeah, although it's
yeah.
interesting because he also like, so Daniel doesn't kill Borbador, of course.
Mhm.
And Daniel, I appreciate his self awareness that he's just like, yeah, I just don't have the strength to kill my best friend that I grew up with. Like I thought I did. I came all the way here. I
Gave it a good
like made a
try.
big stink about it, but in the end, I just can't. And he's like, I know that, so I'm gonna come up with some excuse. And now I have a pretty valid excuse that we need him on our side because of other stuff that developed and how they end up fighting.
Mm.
So,
But
fighting
Tomas
Marquez, that
kind of
is.
saw through that a little bit.
Oh,
I felt
Tomas
like
saw
it's
right
like,
through it.
oh, he did disobey a direct order. I'll have to do something about that. But also, he kind of wasn't wrong either. Just to add
Yeah.
further strain and complexity to their relationship.
Yeah, because it's interesting the dynamic that is added of him being uh, Tamas's son. I think he just kind of knew, like I kind of knew he didn't have the strength to do it, and
Mm.
he's like, yeah, I can't really blame him because what he's doing makes sense, but this is telling about like who Daniel is. And if it was Tamas who got sent there by his dad to go do
Yeah.
that, you know he's finishing that job. Like
Yeah.
That's what he was
finishing
commanded
it
to do.
beautifully. Yeah, and getting all kinds of valor and recognition for it,
Right.
because that's just his style. And yeah, and then you have Daniel who just like avoids his father, and we don't get told too much about the the circumstances in which Tomas's wife, Daniel's mother, died, and it seems to think that there's some family drama, and like you're kind of led to believe that there's more going on there than you get from Tomas's point of view, because we know how he thinks. He's like, she died, I'm mad, like this is what we do. But it's like, okay, well,
We
they hint
throw
that there
people
was some.
into the ocean.
Yeah, yeah,
That's a pretty
exactly.
awesome scene, by the way.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
that's a very good like character establishing scene because it's like I don't know. I always love proactive characters and
Yeah.
characters that can be also like rash and just do things that accelerate the story in a way
Hmm.
that's interesting.
Hmm.
So when they just send over is he Duke Nikislaus? I can't say that. It's
Nick,
a
oh,
Nikslaus. I don't know what to do with that.
Nick Slav. Yeah,
Nikislaus?
yeah.
Nikislaus?
I'm trying
Either
to,
way.
because I listened to the
Uh,
audiobook, so I'm trying to remember. Nick
yeah,
Slav.
either
Nick
way.
Slav.
He shows up. He's the one who personally was responsible for Tamas's wife getting executed. Tamas just sees him and he just chucks him into the ocean.
Even though
That's
he's supposed to
amazing.
treat with this
Yeah,
guy, they have
right.
like, the royal
Yeah.
heir hostage, and they present a pretty formidable force. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I should provide that context. This is like a peace
Samus
negotiation.
knows that that was the wrong thing to do, but he does it anyway. He's like, "What am I
Yeah.
supposed to look this guy in the face?"
Yeah, I'm chucking him into the ocean. And it's interesting. So
He didn't
eventually
kill him.
Tamas,
Like, just got a little wet. What's the
well,
big deal?
eventually he cuts off his freaking like
Well,
privileged hands and he's
in
like,
that
now you know what
moment,
it's like to be rendered powerless. Like that was pretty epic
right,
because he got
right,
like captured and they
and,
like put gold into his body and he was Tamas that is and Tamas
yeah,
was
and his
unable
leg.
to use his powder mage powers for a bit, which is cool from like an identity perspective when it's like that's the number one thing you identify as a powder mage, and then it's like now you're not. And then
Right.
yeah, he's like he gets his vengeance when he
Yeah, he's like,
chops
I'm
off
not done with him, right? Yet. And you're like, oh God. But
yeah.
yeah, that was a pretty fun scene too. Like when he goes to the hunt and then gets captured and um, escapes. That's all some exciting stuff. And we learn about gold. I was kind of like, okay, so gold cancels out powder mage magic. Eventually, it gets to the point where you're like, there's so much stuff in here. Like, it seems
There's
a
a
bit
lot.
arbitrary that gold cancels out powder mage abilities, but I'm like, okay, let's roll
I
with it.
think it's just something that like if Sanderson were writing this, he would have ensured that was well established before Tamas got captured. And then you'd be
Mm.
like, oh no, not gold. I know because Sanderson very clearly like educated me on all the intricacies
Yeah.
of this thing. I very clearly know that gold is not to be used. Or like you would have encountered some character who was like, I used to be a powder mage, and then they put gold in my eye. And I have a golden eye now. And now I can't be a powder mage and I can't really see either. It was not
It's
a good
like,
decision. And you'd be like, okay, I know gold will probably come back and play a role in robbing someone of powder mage powers. So it'd be nice to, in some way be told that beforehand. But it's also like, it's not a big deal. Like,
it's not a big
fine.
deal at all. It's one of those things where it's like, you include it because a lot of times these hard magic systems have checks and balances, and so, oh, this one is gold, and you're like, okay, okay, I guess gold is the opposite of black powder.
Powder?
Yeah.
I don't know if it's an opposite thing.
Well, because like Mistborn, they have like the opposite metals. It's like pewter and silver, and one is the push and one's the pull, and then depending on how you burn it, like that kind of stuff. You kind of get a little bit of that ideology in this magic system, but it's not like a critical component, and I don't think it's one that's even necessary. He's got so many interesting things going on without it anyway. It's all we need to be told, so I can appreciate it from that standpoint. But it does get to be a little bit of like, now we're just throwing stuff at the wall a little bit here is kind of the vibe. And I know he's plotted it out and we'll get more of it and this and that, but it just felt a little bit like magic system spaghetti. Like just like all it's like, oh, there's hard magic and soft magic and knacks and rules and counters and cancellations and gods and oh boy, is a lot to very ambitious in its work. Brian McClellan set out to do everything.
Yeah, and what's kind of interesting about it when you think about how he was Branden Sanderson's student
Mm-hmm.
is so Sanderson has those rules of magic, and it's basically outlining how to deal with hard magic systems, soft magic systems, how to best implement magic as an aspect of storytelling and fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them is essentially depth over breadth. So, like, you'd rather go deep into one thing, like, than start establishing a bunch of new magic
Mm-hmm.
systems. So, and of course, Sanderson kind of in each book in the first Mistborn era spotlights a particular magic system with that book and gives you a lot more depth into that.
Mm-hmm.
And then like because there are like three
Allomancy,
mag
hemalurgy, and some other one.
and the big three.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the big three.
Yeah. So either way, in this one, it does feel like McClellan is super ambitious in being like, there's three magic systems, and I'm just like throwing you into a lot of the intricacies of all of them at once in the course of one book. Of course, the privileged stuff, or there's really four magic systems, I guess. And you get probably the most depth with Powder Mage stuff, but you're trying to track all of these things at once. Like knacks are pretty easy, but they are their own separate magic system. It's just like you can do one thing really like out of the ordinary, basically like Olam not having to sleep or Adamat remembering everything.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you've got powder mages, and we know all that. And then we've got privileged, and the soft magic system nature of it makes it so there's not too much depth, but you still have to be like, okay, they've got these gloves. Like, I guess if you take off his hands, he can't do that anymore. And and if we have our fourth magic system interact with it, which is basically Kapol's, what they call her it's like a bone.
Oh yeah,
Like
yeah,
that's
yeah.
its whole separate thing, and she's got like these voodoo doll type things going for her, and also she can interact with the powder mages by altering their bullets in a way where those can kill privilege. It's like, okay, we're being thrown in the deep end here, like in a bunch of different magic systems, and I will give Brian McClellan credit that he's able to balance all those in a way where we're never like lost and unable to follow what's happening. And at times, yeah, do we need just a random like, oh, and gold makes powder mage powers go away. All right, go. Like,
Gold and
sure, we need a
voodoo
little bit.
dolls and
Yeah.
yeah, it's ambitious and I respect it, and it is you follow it and you're entertained by it, and at the end of the day, that's like the biggest strength and what you should have to do with your story anyway. And so the fact that he never loses sight of that, sometimes with more like amateur fantasy stories. You get people that are so excited about this world that they've built that they just start telling you about it, and the story kind of dissolves. And that's not the case in this at all. It's just as much in terms of all the ideas that he's brought to the table and all the different magic systems. Like if someone told you like, oh, I made a story that has wizards and it has like gunslingers and it has voodoo dolls, and you'd be like,
Yeah.
okay buddy, maybe edit yourself a little bit for the sake
Yeah.
of the story. But he does, it can be overwhelming at times, but he does deliver on the story. So overall, like, you gotta give him mad props for that,
I totally agree, Charles.
especially as a
It's a
debut.
great, yeah, especially as a debut. That's a great point. That I think uh, he he never really world builds for world building's sake, and I guess
No.
part of how he accomplishes that is how little the characters know about certain aspects of the world. Where like Adamat, especially, like his character's purpose is to discover all these things that are either lost knowledge or like people never knew or whatever. And him finding those answers is actually fulfillment of some of what is going on with his plot. So it doesn't feel like it's like, oh, and now we're just giving exposition and world building for its own sake. It's like, oh, now Adamat's finally discovered what he's been trying to figure out forever about what Kresomir's promise is. And he already went on that sort of dead end with the gang and all that kind of stuff. So we're like, all right, that feels like a part of the plot, even though it is just like someone telling you world building things. So I credit how Brian McClellan's able to do that so seamlessly. I'll also say, Charles, we're over an hour in, I think, here,
Mhm.
and I don't want to do our fourth POV dirty over here.
No.
Okay,
No.
Nyla deserves to be discussed.
To be honest, I enjoyed the Nyla chapters when we got them. I kind of remember feeling at the end like, oh, I wish this had more impact to the story than it
Yeah.
ultimately did. And I wish we got a little bit more of it. And I'm sure that this is going to expand, but where this ultimately resolved was, oh, the kid's still alive and you're gonna like be his nanny, and we're leaving now. And we're
Hmm.
going away from all this. And you're like, oh, okay, well, that's kind of where we were at the beginning of this. I don't know why we, went through all this stuff. But like, there were times when she was almost gonna kill Tanis and all these other things. It's like particularly exciting because she's so overlooked by everybody, and she's not
Yeah.
magical, and she has no abilities, or nothing. So it was really interesting in a book so chock full of a million different magic systems to have a POV character who has none of that, holds no political influence, has no abilities, is not an act, is nothing, and is still making her mark in the story, was interesting to me. And I guess leaving me wanting more is never a bad thing, but I also kind of felt like, why did we bother, other than to say that this
Hmm.
princeling is alive? like that's kind of the only thing that seemed to matter, is that there's an heir that's still alive, and what that might mean to Kresomir's promise, and to uh, anything else like future civil wars and things like that. So I don't know,
Yeah.
kind of
That's well
undercut it
said,
for me.
Charles. Yeah, she's not a bad character by any means, and I like what you're getting into about the idea that in this world full of magic and danger and all this stuff, she's just a laundress. But in that way, she had a legitimate shot, I guess, at some point of killing Tamas or something, or at least was plotting to do that. That's pretty
Mhm.
intense.
Mhm.
And it's
And her
because
stakes were
she's so
super high
overlooked.
because she's in fear of getting like basically deported or kicked out, let alone arrested or killed. No, anything could happen to her. She's not critical to the story. So you're like,
Right. Well,
like she's playing at a smaller level, like the stakes are smaller, but anything's possible. And it was exciting.
yeah, I think this is one of the reasons why I pitched the whole series instead of just the
Mm,
single book, because
I was getting
there
that vibe.
are threads like this that some books, like I would say, let's say Mistborn, because we're talking so much Sanderson, Mistborn, The Final Empire is always a book I like to give as an example of a book that's very clearly the first of a trilogy. But also, if you just read that book, like everything was in there for a purpose and received some sort of uh, like resolution that would be satisfying enough. If you had to never read the rest of the books, you'd be like, I read a full story. Like this, I would not say like is that, as I mentioned earlier, and part of it is like if this was a standalone book, you would be like, why does Nyla exist at all in this story? Like she does not impact the plot really at all that I can think of in this
Mm.
book. I mean, we all know that
She
Brian
saved the
McClellan's a very
prince, you know?
talented. She saved the prince, but the prince didn't do anything in the story either.
No,
Like,
no.
yeah, which is the prince was, yeah, briefly. There's a whole thing with the royalists. They were trying to protect the prince. I actually like that part because they build up this whole like, oh yeah, like this royalist general, like he's just as good as Tamas, but he's got different values, and Tamas really respects him, and they just gets like blown up and dies. And I was
Yeah.
like, that was a moment I remember when I was first reading the book. I was like, oh yeah, like this is pretty awesome. Like,
Yeah,
and
right.
I think I mentioned in my pitch to you, I was like, yeah, there's plot points that seem like they're setting up in this book that then like you're like, oh, there's gonna be the whole book dealing with this guy, and then it's just like
Oh,
they'll
you
just
bye
get
bye.
resolved, and that's what's cool about the pacing of the book. Is just like you don't know what's gonna happen. You think it's going one way, you're like, oh nope, just dead. Whatever, forget that guy. Like we build him up, but it was pretty cool in the like chaos of war and everything that's going on to have this character that seems like a main adversary up to Tamas's level is just like, nope, dead. See ya. So I did
Yeah,
like
I
that,
appreciate, and it's
but
like, it's one thing to execute a coup, it's another thing to hold the city, right? And we've read books that were dedicated to holding a captured city, I think of Joe Abercrombie. I think of Game of Thrones, where it's like how many times it was like, oh, it's easy to capture a thing when it's hard to hold it.
yeah,
And it's like, well, that was toyed with in this, but overlooked for other things. And that was a fun part about it. I was kind of surprised too. It's like, wow, we're building this character up, and then anything could happen to anybody at any time.
yeah,
Same thing happened. Temis was captured, and all these people were killed in the process. And his like bodyguard friend, we just got randomly shot at the end. Remember, like mid
yeah,
sentence, the guy gets shot and killed, and you're like,
yeah.
whoa,
One of
like
his
not even like a noteworthy death. He's just went from being a main character in the like Tamis chapters to being gone mid sentence. He
yeah,
is
one of the
able to
powder
incorporate that.
mages, like one of
The
the
one who
only
was
ones
like, I
that
should always be with
survived.
you. I'm gonna protect you.
It's yeah. So it's definitely high stakes. It's a lot of action. I mean,
Oh
it is
yeah.
a lot of politicking and all kind of stuff, but we get a lot of battle scenes. We get privileged and powder mages getting attacked by magical cave lions,
Oh
and
yeah.
yeah, I mean, there's a lot to love for that aspect of it. It's a unique book. It sets a stage for a lot more to go on here. We all know Brian McClellan's a very talented author. I promise you that he didn't write Nyla for absolutely zero reason. So
He's
we'll just
he's
have
got my
to.
trust. I am fully confident that he's got things in the works for all of this, and um I could tell from his writing style and just knowing that he was brought up in the school of Sanderson that it's like, okay, there are setups happening, there's bigger things afoot. I did get Mistborn vibes when we got to the end with some of these like god characters and things. I don't want to spoil Mistborn, but I was like, oh, interesting how that kind of plays out. It's kind of an interesting response to how some of the books in those Mistborn books end too. So curious to see where that goes. And I'm excited to just, dive right into the next one. These books were very fun. Um, a lot of original ideas and original uses of classic tropes, which I fully enjoyed. There's a lot of tropes that I love in fantasy. So it was nice to see them presented in a new way. I enjoyed it quite a bit. I'm looking forward to more.
Yeah. Should we briefly discuss the end? Just that
Let's
they
do
were
it.
trying to summon Kresimir like this whole
Mhm.
time, and then they summon Kresimir, and then Daniel just shoots him
In
twice,
the face.
and in the eye and stuff. Yeah, it's we do. I love that moment when it first happens, and then there's a little bit in that blog about like, oh no, like you can't just kill a god like that, which is fair, but it is kind of cool in the moment. We're just like,
I
oh
do like
crap,
the
did he just
idea of
like
just
shoot
like
the
shoot
god?
the god in the face and then
Yeah,
it
yeah,
works and you're like, oh, cool.
yeah.
Reminds me of I think it was this is gonna be very random. It reminded me of Scary Movie 3, where the
Oh,
aliens are
yeah, of course.
invading and the
The
guy,
third of the scary
because there's a
movie.
joke in it where the
Yeah.
aliens are invading and the guy has a shovel and just hits it in the head and the head flies off and it dies and he's like, without their heads, they're powerless.
Oh, that's
which
funny.
which is like a joke that's just always stuck with me. So it's like, oh yeah, when you shoot him in the face, he dies. It's like it's very effective.
Yeah. Without his brain, he's powerless. When you shoot him through the eye into
Without
the
an
brain.
unshot head, he's
Yeah.
powerless. So
Yeah. Although
yeah, it
that's not the
was
case when it comes to Kresimir, apparently, because we're told in
he
the
just
epilogue that
get some recovery
can't kill
time, but
him.
he'll have to just how many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man? We're coming
Yeah,
back for
just
you.
shoot him again.
Just
It's
shoot him again.
yeah,
That is
it's
something. He's like,
funny
well, I'll
though.
just
The
shoot him again.
setup is great because it's like he came down toward the earth and he was the most beautiful. It's like you looking at Ashton Kutcher. It's like,
Pretty
oh, the
much.
most beautiful man I have ever seen. Like, and then he just shoots him through the eye.
And
Instead
that
of
just
giving him a
stops the
delicious
whole
hot dog like
procession.
you
Yeah,
did.
it stops the
Yeah.
whole ceremony.
Yeah. So it's pretty great.
Yeah, it's effective for sure. So yeah, I'm really, that it's that kind of energy and mentality that this series brings, where it's like we have the like fancy magic, but a lot of this is like gunpowder snorting like maniacs too. So like just the mix is really exciting, and I'm curious to see where it goes from here. I know that he's written like a bunch
Yeah.
of novellas in this world, so it seems like there's a lot more than meets the
Yeah.
eye. Sorry, Kresimir, for
Mm.
that a bit of an insensitivity. Um,
Yeah, not
but
great.
um, but yeah, it seems like there's a lot more going on here. There's a big world brewing, and we've only just gotten a taste of it. So I'm
Mm.
excited to see where it goes.
I'm excited to see where it goes to, Charles, but we'll just have to wait until you and I read the Crimson campaign and then return here to discuss. But in the meantime, we've got Gideon the Ninth that we're
Yeah,
reading right now. That'll be coming up, and
yeah.
yeah, a whole lot of more fun episodes coming your way
So
from the
many
Friends
fun
Talking Fantasy
episodes.
podcast. However, the fun is done for today. I'm going to be honest with these
Yep,
people.
yep.
Like that last Ashton Kutcher joke is all I have left in me,
That
and
was
I
it.
think
The way you weaved in Ashton
yeah,
Kutcher and the cooking and the gun shooting and the
yeah.
eye joke, Scary Movie 3. Like we've done it all. There's nothing left. But
Nothing
that's
left to
it.
say.
I mean, I guess I would say, Brian McClellan has a great podcast that you should check out. He interviews a lot of great authors, Page Break. So
Yes.
recommend checking that out as well. So when you're done listening to all of our episodes, of course, which you're caught up now, so you can go listen. But yeah, definitely check it out. And Dylan, I think with that being said, there's nothing left to do but play that sweet, sweet outro music. What do you say?
I say, let's get that sweet, sweet outro music pumping, Charles.
All righty. Thank you all, one and all, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. If you like what you heard today and you want to support the show, reach out to us over on the socials. Give us a like, send us a message. That's at the FTF Podcast on Instagram and at the FTF Podcast with a number 1 at the end on Twitter. Now, Dylan, if they like what they heard today and they want to support the show even more than following us over on the socials, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast, which you can do over on Spotify. It's just 2 clicks at the top of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast feed, and it helps us so much when you do that. You can also rate and review on Apple Podcasts. When I say review, that means you can write nice things about us alongside your 5-star rating. And whenever you do that, that puts a smile on my face and presumably on Charles's face as well. But just listening is more than enough. Thank you so much for doing that.
Just listening, guys. Thank you all so much for being here. We greatly appreciate it. You guys are awesome. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.